We get exposed to our environment through the air we breathe, through the foods we ingest, and also through the water we drink. We're also passively exposed through our skin, which is our largest organ. So if there is any kind of air pollution, those are things that can impact our health and well-being. If you remember, dose makes the poison, then moderation is your best defense for prevention and long-term happiness. So balance, moderation, however you want to think about it, but build healthier habits slowly, and you're much more effective in creating the long-term result that you want.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited for you to meet our guest today, superstar cancer researcher, Dr. Natalie Gassman. She is an associate professor of pharmacology and toxicology at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. And we will be taking a deep dive into environmental exposures in the water, air, and elsewhere, and how they can affect our risk of developing cancer. Stay with us. We've got a lot of good, positive information here, I promise. And we're going to finish up by talking about the danger of vaping. And Dr. Gassman has some astounding words to describe it. Cancer is just something that we all have to recognize, acknowledge, cope with, live with, struggle with, rage upon, crush, and even thrive with. This show is more than knowing and fighting or beating cancer. It's more than just relaying science, hope, and technology. Together, our purpose is to demystify cancer, take away as much fear out of the diagnosis, treatment, and process as we can, defeat its grip on our lives. This is The Cancering Show. Natalie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm happy to be here.
Start by telling our listeners a little bit about your story and how you came to be doing cancer research at MCI.
So I went to college at Michigan State University, and I wanted to be a forensic scientist. And as I was getting my criminal justice degree, I learned that I had to get more heavily into science. And so I started doing chemistry. And then I was accepted to UCLA into their Ph.D. program in physical chemistry, which is all about quantum mechanics. And all I kept thinking when I was there was that I wanted to do more biology and biological applications, and I wanted to be more involved in translational kind of studies. But unfortunately, I was so far away from human beings that I had to kind of inch my way back. And so I did a series of postdoctoral fellowships at Wake Forest University, and then finally at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And that's where I really started to understand how the environment and our lifestyles impacted our bodies. And so when I was able to transition into my own lab here at Mitchell Cancer Institute, I really got to explore how environmental agents and environmental exposures impacted cancer and how we could maybe mitigate those things to improve our lives.
And it's so amazing that we have you at MCI. I get these questions from our patients all the time. I know you're studying this at a very granular level, but just from an overview perspective, can you give our listeners an idea of what and how the environment impacts our bodies just in general?
Sure. So I think the easiest example we can think of is the sun, right? So everyone's aware from a very young age, if you go out in the sun, your skin slowly changes color, and then sometimes it will violently change color to red and maybe blister. And what we've learned, historically over time is the more times that happens, that we have these kind of red blistering sunburn events, the increased likelihood that you will develop some kind of skin cancer. And so even though this is something that we have very limited control over, right? We have to go outside. We want to be outside for vitamin D. We want to go to work. We want to go to school. We have developed strategies to mitigate that type of exposure by using better plastics and better glass in our cars and in our buildings, and then also using creams such as sunscreen on our skin to reduce the amount of damaging UV exposure and therefore reduce our risk of developing skin cancer. And while that's a very global and I would say bright example of an environmental exposure, we get exposed to our environment through the air we breathe, through the foods we ingest, and also through the water we drink. We're also passively exposed through our skin, which is our largest organ. So if there is any kind of air pollution, that's going to settle on your skin. If you've ever lived in a major city, you kind of get a gray tint during the day that it will accumulate. Those are all environmental exposures that we may or may not necessarily think about, but those are things that can impact our health and well-being.
And I just so appreciate that overview. I know that there are some patients who really wonder, like, how does all that cause cancer?
So there's a lot of different ways. My lab is really interested in how it affects our genomes. So our, genetic base code, you might be familiar with 23andMe and this like ancestry DNA. We all have a unique base code sequence. And while it is unique to you, functionally, it boils down to the same sets of proteins and the same set of functional actions that keep your cells alive, keep you alive. And these change as we grow and age. And so at different points in our lifestyle or different points in our life, like line, these exposures can alter our genome. And some of these alterations are very mild and no consequence occurs from them. But some of the alterations are actually very detrimental, and they can cause what we call driving mutations or oncogenic mutations that kind of set the stage for things to kind of go awry. So it's like going from an asphalt road to a gravel road to now you're on loose dirt and you don't have traction anymore. And so our DNA loses the critical integrity to keep the cell in the exact function that it's supposed to perform. And when that happens, you end up on this pre-cancerous track. And then as those changes get to a point where you can't ever reverse them and your body can't kill that cell off, then you end up transforming into a cancer cell and multiplying, and then eventually you can get a tumor. And then, of course, wonderful doctors like you interfere to prolong our lives when these tumors develop.
So I just love the way that you explain that in such detail at a level that people can really understand. And I think it's really important for patients to understand that they can affect their cancer risk. I think there are some things we already know, like you said, wearing sunscreen or, not smoking tobacco or chewing tobacco products. Those are the obvious ones. But there are some other things in our environment that maybe have more or less evidence, but can be a little bit worrisome. I know that question is going to come up before we get too detailed into your specific research. What are some of the things in your life that you avoid?
Well, I'm a very pale person, so I avoid sun exposure because I have the natural heredity and skin tone to burn, unfortunately. I also try to avoid large city environments where you would have like high pollution levels. So, industrial areas of town, I'm not going to go jogging in them. I think it's harder, though, to avoid some of the risk factors that we have on a daily basis. So, personally, I don't eat a lot of fast food, but some of the coatings in the cups from fast food and also in the wrappers from fast food wrappers, they contain agents that have been found to increase your risk of not cancer necessarily yet. We're still on that epidemiological track, but they do have detrimental consequences to your genetic material and potentially have links to obesity and diabetes and hyperactivity neurological disorders. And so those kind of risk factors are on a path of kind of pre-cancerous to cancerous. So I try to avoid things that I would consider high risk. Obviously, pesticides. I don't spray my yard willingly, and I don't let others spray my yard. There are ways to mitigate risk, but I think avoidance is a very easy way for me to do that.
Yeah, that's really excellent. I'd love to hear more about your specific research, how all of these kind of environmental concerns have led you to both the research and the discoveries and most recently your grant activities.
So I think the best example that I can and kind of start with is I studied in my postdoctoral fellowship at the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, the plasticizer BPA. And so it's a little older now, but in the early aughts into the late, aughts into the 2010 era, BPA was kind of a hot button issue in the media. There was a lot of press about leaching of BPA into groundwater, into soil. It's what we call a high production volume chemical. So billions and billions of pounds of BPA are made each year. It has great functions. It makes up medical devices. It's a catalyst for polymerization. So it's a really, really useful chemical. But unfortunately, it has the same chemical structure as some of our hormones. And so if you're overexposed to that chemical, you can actually outcompete some of your hormones in your body. And so you get disrupted cell signaling. For my particular research, we wanted to know how it would actually affect your genome. And so we took a novel angle of looking at how bisphenol A's in your plastic bottles, medical devices, epoxy, thermal paper receipts from your cashier receipts actually impacted your genome. And so what we found is that not only could it directly damage your DNA, but can also create a higher level of oxidative stress, which also increases your damage level of your DNA. And one of the really interesting things we found, which is how I actually ended up, having my own independent laboratory, is that BPA increases the levels of oxidative stress to the extent that you actually maintain DNA damage in your genome. And so that was a really interesting concept to me, because at the time, the whole paradigm was that your DNA repair systems in your cells were so efficient and amazing that you shouldn't have a lot of DNA damage hanging around. Obviously, your cells are undergoing DNA damage on a continual basis because we're alive and we breathe and we eat things. And so there is a level of damage that will always occur. But when you spike that level of damage from an exposure, your repair systems are supposed to basically kind of mobilize, like search and rescue, find the DNA damage and throw it out. And so
yeah, I equate it to, little kids falling, getting scrapes and cuts and burns, and then, it's supposed to all get repaired without scars.
Yeah. So it was really interesting to me that when you got exposed to BPA, not only did you induce DNA damage, but your DNA repair systems didn't seem to mobilize to repair it. And so that can be a recipe over time to actually maintain the damage in the genome, which can create mutations.
That makes sense. That ultimately this damage that's occurred that's not repaired becomes the source of a future gene mutation that leads to cancer or to some other problem.
Mm-hmm. And so that's the standpoint we started with. And when we kept looking at BPA, it has what we call a lot of pleiotropic effects, which really just is a fancy way of saying it affects multiple systems at the same time. So not only is it damaging the DNA, but it's changing how your cell metabolizes sugars. It's changing how your membrane metabolizes fats. It's changing how your endoplasmic reticulum works. It's changing how your cell is signaling and propagating messages. So it does a lot of things at the same time as it's creating DNA damage. And so those consequences can be even more devastating because it's not just one mechanism of action, it's multiple mechanisms of action.
And so taking all of this together, when you think about prevention and avoidance, do you think that there is a timeline where it's more important to avoid? We know, as you and I were discussing before, out in preparation for this call, that age is a key component of the risk for cancer because of this compounding effect of DNA damage over time. Do you feel like there is a timeline during which people are more or less susceptible?
There definitely is. And actually, in terms of BPA, there is more regulation when you are pregnant. So the fact is, we're not just a biome, especially women, we're not just a biome by ourselves. We are also a biome that is our genetic material moving forward. So for women, when you're, not pregnant, you still have all of your ovum to become pregnant. And when you are pregnant, you have a developing fetus that has sex organs that may or may not develop into more eggs or sperm for future propagation. And so one of the big risk factors that people guard against for environmental exposures is exposure during pregnancy, so perinatal and prenatal exposure, and then also exposure through breast milk in the postnatal period. And so back in 2008, 2009, while we didn't ban BPA, we strongly recommended that it would be removed from any products, baby bottles, and warned pregnant and nursing women to avoid those materials. And so one of the things, like we're talking about with aging, is that if you load up the damage before you're even fully developed, you're going to change how you develop. And so you could see accelerated aging, hyperactivity, neural changes in neurological function, and obesity at a much younger age. So you almost have kids with hormones and metabolic profiles that are atypical for a healthy developing child. But also, as we age, one of the biggest things between 20 and 40 now is fertility, right? So if you're in that zone and you want to be your most fertile, these environmental exposures can really reduce your fertility. And so there is no conclusive link, but the Endocrine Society has strongly said that the culmination of xenoestrogen exposures that the population, especially in these first world countries like the US, are exposed to, likely contribute to our decrease in fertility. And so a lot of people have fertility struggles, and that might be a consequence of environmental exposures. It's just really hard to encapsulate because we're all exposed to different things.
Yeah, it's so hard to know for sure what people are being exposed to. Before we move on from BPA, are there any online resources that you would recommend that help people to better understand what things that they could cut out in order to decrease their exposure?
Sure. So the National Toxicology Program, the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences, and the Endocrine Society have a lot of resources about where exposures exist and how you can minimize them. I think, a lot of people, they're going to grasp onto the easy things like industrialized chemicals and, waste that's buried in the ground. But it is a little more insidious than that. If you've seen a lot of the current news articles on phthalates, that's the wrapper in your, hamburger from your fast food joint or your taco from your taco joint. It's also one of the stabilizers in the shampoo that you use in the shower every day. So some of the chemicals that we expose ourselves to are more of a convenience. So you should kind of keep an eye out for things that make your life more convenient, because they more than likely contain more chemicals than things that, unfortunately make your life less convenient. So making your own bread is going to have way less additives than buying bread off the shelf.
So true, right? The slow food movement is where we all need to be headed. And that is a very important and another aspect of cancer prevention and doing well with cancer treatment. I did want to change our conversation and focus on your research in vaping and e-cigarettes. We get these questions all the time. Patients are told that e-cigarettes are a healthy alternative to cigarettes. We know that they have been marketed that way. And yet you see articles in the news of even children being hospitalized because of toxicity.
So we became interested in e-cigarettes actually kind of from the same pot as bisphenol A. We were looking at small molecule exposures that we were willingly or unwillingly exposing ourselves to. And one of the chemicals we came across is dihydroxyacetone, which we use in sunless tanning products, which is an alternative to UV exposure. But it turns out it's also a combustion product from vaping. And so what's interesting about vaping is that you have combustion, just like you do in a traditional cigarette. And the act of combustion,
meaning burning something to make a smoke.
So combustion in an electronic cigarette actually creates the aerosol.
Okay.
So it's not a water vapor. And in the case of electronic cigarettes, it's actually an aerosol. It's a very fine particle matter that's created from the mobilant, which is usually propylene glycol and glycerol in some ratio, plus whatever flavorings you want to add in, and quite frequently nicotine as well.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of the same elements that you have in traditional cigarettes. They're just kind of packaged in a new format, and people tend to forget that combustion can create some of the same products that you get from traditional cigarettes. So even if the electronic cigarette doesn't contain nicotine, you can still have dangerous chemical products being produced like formaldehyde, glyceraldehyde, and other chemicals that can create issues for you to breathe in. And so it's almost like breathing in air pollution.
I'm going to have you say that again because I think that's so important for people to hear. But, when you name all these big things, but just for folks to understand, polyethylene glycol, correct me if I'm wrong, is antifreeze, right?
Polyethylene glycol is antifreeze, but propylene glycol is a derivative. It's not dissimilar. It's in a similar chemical family.
Okay, so we could say it's antifreeze's first cousin.
Yes.
And then formaldehyde is that nasty stuff in biology class in high school that preserves the frogs before you dissect them.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the types of chemicals that folks are now inhaling.
Yes.
And I want you to say one more time what you said about inhaling an e-cigarette. Yeah.
So, I mean, an e-cigarette and a traditional cigarette, you're directly inhaling air pollution, a very concentrated mix of air pollution.
Like putting your mouth on one of those big pipes in a city that has all the smoke coming out of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting chemical reactions that, especially in electronic cigarettes. So, there's these mass spec studies that show there's like 200 chemicals in a single puff of an e-cigarette. So a lot of that goes back to what's actually making up the e-cigarette. So you have two main ingredients in your Mobilins, but people now have these custom made flavors, or they add, THC, they add vitamin E, which is what alleged to have caused the big E Valley pathology in 2019, which feels so long ago, where young adults were having severe lung failure from vaping. And so we add all these additives now, we light them on fire, and then we assume it's safer than traditional cigarettes. And the fact of the matter is the FDA has now had to come back and say, we don't know what happens when you light all these chemicals on fire. And it turns out it's dangerous. So they've gone through and really regulated to reduce the number of chemicals in electronic cigarettes. But they have to fight an uphill battle now because people want customizable, flavored electronic cigarettes. And they're making this flamethrower of chemicals that you're inhaling, you're holding into your lungs, and then your lungs are right next to your heart, right next to your vascular system. There's no first pass metabolism through your liver or the protection from your gut microbiome when you're exposed to it. So you're putting it into your lung and you're circulating it into your body. And so you're not protecting yourself in all the ways that your body wants to protect you.
Yeah, no, I never really heard it described that way. And I so appreciate what you're saying. We think of skin as a protected barrier. Your gut has the bacteria that helps break things down and protect you. And then everything, from your gut gets absorbed and passed through the liver for those toxins. So when you do inhale something, those lungs that go straight to the bloodstream. I hadn't thought of it quite that way.
Yeah, so we're studying a combustion product from the Mobilins, so from the propylene glycol and the glycerol, because that is of interest to us because it's a high content volume. I mean, your flavoring is a very small aspect and not everyone's going to use the same flavoring, but everyone's going to use e-juice, which is the liquid that allows you to do this combustion reaction. And so we've actually started studying dihydroxyacetone and how it affects cells. And it's just as interesting as bisphenol A in that it actually can metabolically reprogram your cells and cause your mitochondria to be less efficient. And so when you see these kind of phenotypes of energy metabolism changes, that's a hallmark of cancer, a long-term hallmark of cancer, but metabolic changes have lots of consequences. inefficiency in your mitochondria reduce the energy that your cell has, and eventually will reduce the energy that you have systemically. So we see that a lot in obesity and diabetes. So
Mhm.
now you have, a lot of chemicals we don't really understand the consequences of. And we have this mobilant now that we're showing is not great for you either. And so I think it's going to be a really interesting field of research. I'm really starting to learn about metabolomics and changes in the cell energy balance. And I think that's really important in terms of cancer, because there's high energy cancer cells that kind of cause wasting. And so, you see people rapidly lose weight and the tumors really kind of energetically active. And then you also see tumors that can kind of hide in plain sight because they are in energy balance with their environment. And so a lot of the chemicals that we use, in addition to the DNA damaging chemicals and chemotherapy, are to kind of to attack these metabolic changes, so that we can really exploit them to cause, chemotherapy to work better. And so you see a lot of, interrelationships between metabolism and immunology. And I'm not well versed in that area, but I think that you definitely are going to keep seeing this kind of balance between how do we get our bodies to attack the cell and how do we get the cancer cell to die. And we have to get better
Sure.
strategies to do it.
Yeah, no, and I do think that's so interesting to think about. On the one hand, we are looking for chemicals that are toxic to our bodies and avoiding them and making sure that they don't enter our bodies. And yet, sometimes those are the very thing that we are potentially in the future going to manipulate to treat cancers, because if they are damaging to cells, maybe they damage those cancer cells and allow our immune system to take over and work. So I think there's just so many interesting aspects of what you do and how it affects our current and future in cancer. To kind of harness this, what do you think is the future for environmental impacts on cancer? I haven't put a lot of stock in outright prevention, other than hopefully we are past the worst of the obesity epidemic, and things are starting to head in the right direction there. Hopefully smoking will continue to decrease in number. What are the things from that kind of environmental toxin aspect that you think kind of we're on the right track, that in the future these things maybe won't be as much of a problem?
Well, I mean, I think our awareness of our environment is increasing. I think the dramatic changes we saw in our environment during the pandemic was shocking to people. Like, even though, we always kind of tend towards radical changes, like I'm going to lose 100 pounds, where it might have been better for you to lose a pound a week for, 100 weeks rather than 100 pounds in 6 weeks, however,
Right.
however we do things. I think what the two things that always speak to me is, in toxicology, the dose makes. So just because something has negative consequences, it doesn't mean you're at a dose where you're experiencing them right now. So you have to be aware some effects are cumulative, some effects are acute. So you can balance having the lifestyle that you want and using convenience products, as long as you balance it with other things in your life that create a healthy lifestyle, like exercise, diet. Having antioxidants in your diet is critical to maintaining a healthy metabolic balance and detoxifying balance in your body.
So you're saying that glass of red wine at night is still good?
It's still good. Everything in moderation is probably the best philosophy for environmental exposures. You don't want to willingly expose yourself to anything in huge doses, but you have to acknowledge you're going to go outside and you're going to go in the sun. And maybe it's just for 5 minutes as you run between buildings. So you don't have to, 100 SPF your face for that 5 minutes. It's better if you do, but you have to have a functional lifestyle and a happy lifestyle, or these radical changes are going to make your life miserable. So if you can introduce moderate changes, like you said, slow food a couple days a week, SPF on your face every single morning, and then remember to reapply as your motto, then you're going to build healthy lifestyle, healthy habits, and you're going to actually achieve prevention rather than trying to radically change all your habits all at once. And I'm sure we've all done this on January 1st and then have nothing work and then constantly have to reinvent the wheel. So I think, again, if you remember dose makes the poison, then moderation is your best defense for prevention and long-term happiness, right? So balance, moderation, however you want to think about it, but build healthier habits slowly, and you're much more effective in creating the long-term result that you want.
I can't think of a better place to stop our conversation. Dr. Gassman, everything that you have said is just like blowing my mind and so interesting. I wish we had more time to delve further into your research, but thank you so much for the way that you broke it down for our listeners and really helped us to understand that connection between the toxins in our environment, the cells in our body, and how all of that plays into both our risk for cancer and our ability within ourselves to prevent it. So we really appreciate you coming on today.
I'm really happy to be here, and this show is great for all the people interested in changing their lives and creating prevention in their lives. So
thank you so much.
Jennifer, thank you so much for having me on the Cancering podcast. I'm very excited to be here and talk about my research, and I think it's a wonderful podcast for MCI and all of the interested people in cancer and cancer prevention.
So listeners, to me, learning about the environment and our exposures can be empowering, not just scary. And like Dr. Gassman said, it's all about moderation and the everyday choices we make. And the more we know, the better decisions we can make about what we eat and breathe and expose ourselves to, like the sun. And again, I love the idea of balance, making choices we can live with rather than making radical changes in either direction. That wraps up episode 24 of The Cancering Show. Our next episode, we will talk with a high school teacher and another author who is a lymphoma survivor, and about how he finds a silver lining in his cancer journey.
Thanks everyone for listening to The Cancering Show with JYP, Dr. Jennifer Young-Pierce. Please subscribe, rate, and review this show on iTunes and anywhere else you listen to your favorite podcasts. Want us to deliver The Cancering Show to your email inbox? Contact us at cancering.com and we can make sure you never miss an episode. We would love to know what you think about the show, or if you have any suggestions on topics you would like to hear. You can reach out to us on Facebook, Twitter, and cancering.com. Till next time, be healthy, happy, and always thriving.
This show is brought to you by the University of South Alabama Mitchell Cancer Institute. MCI is a cutting-edge cancer research and patient center built to fight cancer smarter in Mobile and Baldwin County, Alabama. Our researchers and clinicians focus daily on the struggle against cancer, serving a potential catchment population of more than 4.1 million people, with a singular focus of advancing cancer diagnosis, treatment, and prevention throughout the Gulf Coast and beyond, with science, technology, and hope. Want to know more about the Mitchell Cancer Institute? Visit us at usamci.com or search for us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Mitchell Cancer Institute is a member of USA Health. To learn more about all of our hospitals, clinics, and services, visit usahealthsystem.com.